In August 1945, Soviet soldiers in Estonia found a German soldier hiding in a forest. He was wearing a World War I uniform. His rifle was from 1914. When they captured him, he asked them who won the Battle of Verdun. He didn't know World War I had ended. He didn't know World War II had happened. He'd been hiding in that forest since 1918, 27 years, fighting a war that had been over for nearly 3 decades. This sounds impossible, but it happened, and the truth is even stranger than you think. This is the story of how one man's mind broke so completely that he lived in the wrong war for 27 years, and what his story tells us about trauma, memory, and the devastating power of fear. Before we dive into this soldier's story, we need to understand something important. This isn't just about one confused man in a forest. This is about what war does to the human mind, about how trauma can literally trap you in time, about how thousands of soldiers from multiple wars have hidden in forests, jungles, and mountains for years, sometimes decades, because their minds couldn't accept that the fighting was over. The phenomenon has a name. Stragglers, holdouts. The Japanese had dozens of them after World War II. Soldiers who hid on Pacific islands, fighting a war that ended in 1945, surrendering in the 1950s, 60s, even the 1970s. The most famous was Lieutenant Hiru Onoda, who surrendered in 1974, 29 years after Japan's surrender. But the Germans had them too, and our soldier, the man who thought World War I was still happening in 1945, might be the strangest case of all. Let me tell you what we know for certain, because separating fact from legend in this story is tricky. Soviet military records from August 1945, declassified in the 1990s, document the capture of a German soldier in a forest near Tartu, Estonia. The soldier was approximately 45 to 50 years old. He was wearing a deteriorated Imperial German Army uniform from World War I. He spoke German with a Prussian accent. He was severely malnourished, and according to the Soviet report, he appeared to be under the impression that World War I was still ongoing. The Soviets interrogated him for 3 days. The interrogation transcripts exist. They're in Russian military archives. They're bizarre. The soldier, whose name in the documents is listed only as Wagner, claimed to be a private in the German 8th Army. The 8th Army was a World War I formation that ceased to exist in 1918. Wagner insisted it was 1918. When interrogators told him it was 1945, he became agitated and accused them of lying. When they told him Germany had fought and lost another world war, he laughed. He thought they were trying to confuse him, some kind of interrogation tactic. The Soviet officers didn't know what to do with him. He clearly wasn't a threat. He wasn't a Nazi. He was wearing a World War I uniform, for God's sake. He didn't even know who Hitler was. They eventually sent him to a psychiatric facility. And that's where the trail goes cold. Soviet records after 1945 are incomplete. We don't know what happened to Wagner after that. Did he ever accept the truth? Did he die still believing it was World War I? We don't know. But here's what makes this story so fascinating and so tragic. How does a human mind do this? How do you hide in a forest for 27 years, alone, thinking you're still fighting a war that ended decades ago? To understand that, we need to go back to where this story really begins. World War I. The Eastern Front, Estonia, 1918. The Eastern Front in World War I was chaos. The Western Front, France and Belgium, gets all the attention. Trenches, stalemate, Verdun, the Somme. But the Eastern Front was different. It stretched from the Baltic Sea to the Black Sea. Thousands of miles. Armies moved back and forth across vast distances. And in 1917, everything collapsed when Russia had its revolution. The Russian Empire fell apart. The Bolsheviks took power. Russia signed an armistice with Germany in December 1917 and a peace treaty, the the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, in March 1918. That treaty was supposed to end the fighting on the Eastern Front, but it didn't. Not really. Because the treaty created a power vacuum. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, tried to gain independence. Germany occupied them. Then Germany lost World War I in November 1918. Then the German army withdrew. Then the Bolsheviks tried to reconquer the Baltic states. Then White Russian armies, anti-Bolshevik forces, got involved. Then German Freikorps, volunteer units, came back to fight the Bolsheviks. It was a mess, an absolute chaotic mess that lasted from 1918 until 1920. Thousands of soldiers were stranded in this chaos, cut off from their units, lost in unfamiliar territory, with no clear chain of command, no way to get home. Some were captured, some were killed, some deserted and tried to blend into the local population, and some, apparently, hid in the forests and waited for orders that never came. Now, imagine you're a German soldier in Estonia in November 1918. You're 19, maybe 20 years old. You're from a small town in Prussia. You've been fighting for 3 years. You've seen horrors. Your friends are dead. Your officers are dead. You're exhausted. You're traumatized. You're terrified. And one day, you wake up and your unit is gone. Everyone left during the night. You're alone. No food, no clear orders. Enemy forces you don't even know which enemy are somewhere nearby. What do? If you're thinking clearly, rationally, you try to find your way home. You head west. You surrender to someone. You survive. But if you're not thinking clearly, if your mind is already fracturing from years of combat stress, from what we'd now call PTSD, you might make a different choice. You might hide. You might decide to wait for your unit to come back. You might convince yourself that if you just stay hidden, stay alive, eventually German forces will return and you'll be rescued. And if you're hiding in a forest, with no contact with the outside world, with no newspapers, no radio, no other people, how would you know the war ended? You wouldn't. Days become weeks. Weeks become months. Months become years. And in your mind, it's still 1918. You're still waiting. Still hiding. Still fighting a war that ended decades ago. This is what we think happened to Wagner. We think he was a soldier who got separated from his unit in late 1918, hid in the forest, and for whatever reason, psychological breakdown, extreme trauma, simple terror, never came out. And over the years, his mind constructed a reality in which he was still fighting World War I. Let me tell you about someone else this happened to, because Wagner wasn't the only one. There was another German soldier, found in 1947 in a forest in Poland. Karl-Heinz, aged 52 when captured, wearing World War I uniform. He'd been hiding since 1919, 28 years. Soviet soldiers found him living in a crude shelter made of logs and branches. He had a rifle from World War I. He had no ammunition left, hadn't had ammunition for years, but he still carried the rifle everywhere. When they captured him, he asked if the Kaiser had won the war yet. Karl-Heinz's story is documented in Polish archives. He was sent to a psychiatric hospital in Warsaw. Doctors tried to explain to him that it was 1947, not 1919. He didn't believe them. He thought they were enemy soldiers trying to trick him. The doctors eventually gave up trying to convince him. They just let him live out his days in the hospital, still believing it was World War I. He died in 1952, never accepting the truth. These stories, Wagner and Karl-Heinz and others, they sound like fiction. They sound impossible, but they're documented. Soviet and Polish archives have records of multiple German soldiers found hiding in forests in the years after World War II, wearing World War I uniforms, claiming to still be fighting the First War. Not World War II, World War I, Why World War I? Here's what psychiatrists who've studied these cases think. World War I was so traumatic, so devastating, that for some soldiers, their minds simply stopped processing reality after a certain point. They experienced something so horrible, probably in late 1918 or early 1919, that their brains essentially froze in that moment. Psychologists call it dissociative fugue, a state where you lose track of your identity and your sense of time. You're mentally stuck in a specific moment, and everything after that moment doesn't register as real. For Wagner and soldiers like him, the moment they got stuck in was late 1918. Everything after that, the armistice, the Treaty of Versailles, the 1920s, the 1930s, Hitler, World War II, all of it never registered. Their minds rejected it, because accepting it would mean accepting that they'd been hiding, alone, terrified, for nothing, for years. That kind of realization would break most people. So their minds protected them by simply refusing to acknowledge the passage of time. Now, you might be asking, how did they survive? How do you live in a forest for 27 years? What do you eat? Where do you sleep? How do you avoid being discovered? These are good questions, and the answers are disturbing. Wagner, according to Soviet reports, was living in a series of underground shelters he'd dug in the forest. Crude bunkers, really. Holes in the ground covered with logs and branches. He'd move between them, never staying in one place too long. He survived by foraging. Berries, nuts, roots. He trapped small animals, rabbits, squirrels. He ate them raw because he couldn't risk lighting fires that might give away his position. He drank from streams. In winter, he stayed underground as much as possible to avoid freezing to death. The Soviet report notes that Wagner was severely malnourished when captured. He weighed approximately 100 pounds. He was covered in scars, frostbite damage on his fingers and toes, infections. His teeth were mostly gone. He looked like a skeleton. The doctors who examined him estimated that he probably wouldn't have survived another winter. Living this way for 27 years is almost incomprehensible. The isolation alone would drive most people insane. But Wagner had already gone insane, in a sense. His delusion, his belief that it was still 1918, that he was still a soldier waiting for his unit, that's what kept him alive. It gave him purpose. It gave him structure. Wake up, stay hidden, watch for enemy patrols, forage for food, survive another day. That routine, repeated for 10,000 days, was all that kept him going. But here's the most tragic part. Even while Wagner was hiding in his forest, convinced it was World War I, World War II was happening all around him. Estonia was invaded by the Soviet Union in 1940. German forces invaded in 1941. Massive battles were fought. The siege of Leningrad just a few hundred miles away. Operation Barbarossa rolled through the Baltic states, and Wagner, in his forest, didn't know any of it was happening, or if he saw evidence of it, German troops marching past, Soviet troops marching past, tanks, aircraft, he interpreted it all through the lens of World War I. His mind made it fit his reality. Imagine that. Imagine watching World War II happen and thinking you're seeing World War I. Seeing a Panzer tank and thinking it's a World War I tank. Hearing aircraft and thinking they're biplanes. It's a level of cognitive dissonance that's almost impossible to comprehend. But that's what trauma does. It warps reality until reality fits what your damaged mind can handle. Let me tell you about another case that helps illustrate this. Not a German, but a Japanese soldier, Shoichi Yokoi, found hiding in Guam in 1972. He'd been hiding since 1944, 28 years. When they found him, he knew World War II had ended. but he was hiding anyway because he was too ashamed to surrender. He said, "It is with much embarrassment that I return alive." That's Japanese military culture, death before dishonor. But here's the key detail. Yokoi knew the war was over. He'd found newspapers, he'd seen evidence. But he stayed hidden for 28 years anyway, because shame was stronger than reality. Wagner was different. Wagner didn't know. His mind had built a wall that wouldn't let reality in. That makes his case more extreme than Yokoi, more extreme than almost any other holdout soldier in history. Because it wasn't shame keeping him in that forest. It was a complete break from reality. Now, let's talk about what happened when Wagner was captured. The Soviet interrogation transcripts, translated from Russian, are absolutely fascinating and heartbreaking. The interrogator, a Soviet captain named Dmitry Sokolov, according to the documents, tried multiple times to explain to Wagner that it was 1945, not 1918. The transcript reads like this. Sokolov asks, "Do you know what year it is?" Wagner answers, 1918. Sokolov says, "No, it is 1945. Wagner becomes agitated, says, "That's impossible. You're lying." Sokolov tries a different approach. He asks, "Do you know who Adolf Hitler is?" Wagner says, "No. Who is that? Is he a general?" Sokolov explains that Hitler was the leader of Germany, that Germany fought another war, that Germany lost. Wagner says, "This is a trick. You're trying to confuse me. The Kaiser is the leader of Germany." Sokolov asks, "Do you remember the armistice? Do you remember the end of the war?" Wagner says, "The war isn't over. We're still fighting." This went on for hours, according to the transcripts. Sokolov brought in maps, newspapers, photographs, anything to prove to Wagner that 27 years had passed. Wagner rejected all of it. He had an explanation for everything. The maps were forgeries. The newspapers were propaganda. The photographs were faked. His mind had built such a strong protective delusion that no amount of evidence could break through it. Eventually, the Soviet interrogators gave up. They labeled Wagner as psychologically unfit. They sent him to a psychiatric hospital, and that's where the official record ends. But here's where the story gets even more interesting, because there are unofficial accounts, memoirs from Soviet doctors who worked in psychiatric facilities in the late 1940s, that mention a German patient who believed he was still fighting World War I. One doctor, whose memoir was published in Russia in the 1990s, describes treating a German patient in 1946 who insisted it was 1918. The doctor doesn't name the patient, but the description matches Wagner. The doctor writes, "I tried everything to bring him back to reality. I showed him modern technology, automobiles, aircraft, things that didn't exist in 1918. He explained them all away. He said they were new German weapons, or Allied weapons. He could make anything fit his narrative. His delusion was unbreakable." The doctor goes on. The most disturbing part was that he wasn't stupid. He wasn't mentally deficient in any traditional sense. He could reason. He could remember details from his time in the forest. He could describe his daily routine with perfect clarity. But he couldn't accept that time had passed. That one fact, that single piece of reality, was impossible for him to incorporate. So he rejected it, and he rejected everything that came with it. According to this doctor's memoir, the German patient, possibly Wagner, died in 1948, still believing it was World War I. The doctor writes, "In his final days, he asked me if Germany had won yet. I told him yes. I told him Germany won, the war is over, you can rest now." He smiled. He said, "I knew we would win. I knew the Kaiser wouldn't let us down." Then he died. I lied to him. But what else could I do? The truth would have killed him anyway. If this account is accurate, and we can't be certain it refers to Wagner, but if it is, then Wagner never learned the truth. He died believing he'd fought honorably in World War I and that his side had won. In a way, that's merciful. Because imagine the alternative. Imagine someone finally convincing him it was 1948, that he'd hidden in a forest for 3 decades, that everyone he knew was dead or had moved on, that he'd wasted his entire adult life hiding from a war that ended in 1918. That realization would be crushing. It would be, in a very real sense, worse than death. Now let's talk about the broader implications of this story, because Wagner wasn't an isolated case. After World War II, Allied forces found dozens, possibly hundreds of soldiers who'd been living in hiding for years. Most were from World War II, hiding for a few years, but some were from World War I, hiding for decades. The chaos of the Eastern Front, the collapse of empires, the redrawing of borders, all of it created conditions where soldiers could simply disappear. And it wasn't just Germans. There were Russian soldiers who hid after the Russian Civil War. There were Polish soldiers who hid after both world wars. There were soldiers from a dozen different armies who got lost, got scared, got traumatized, and just never came home. Most of them eventually died in the forests and mountains where they hid. Their bodies were never found. Their families never knew what happened to them. They just vanished. This is one of the hidden costs of war that doesn't get talked about enough. We count the dead. We count the wounded, but we don't count the disappeared. The men who walked into the fog of war and never came out. Not because they were killed, but because something inside them broke and they couldn't find their way back. Let me tell you about one more soldier. This one is German, but from World War II. His name was Georg Gärtner. He was captured by American forces in 1944 and brought to the United States as a POW. He was held in a prison camp in New Mexico. In 1945, he escaped. He spent the next 40 years living in the United States under a fake identity. He worked as a ski instructor. He got married. He had a life. But he lived in constant fear of being discovered and deported. In 1985, 40 years after escaping, he finally turned himself in. He was 64 years old. He'd spent his entire adult life as a fugitive from a war that ended before he was 25. When asked why he hid for so long, Gärtner said, "I was afraid. I didn't know what would happen if I revealed myself, so I just kept hiding." Years became decades, and after a while, it was easier to keep hiding than to face the truth. That's what these holdout soldiers have in common: fear, trauma, and a reality that became too difficult to face, so they hid. Some, like Gärtner, knew the war was over but hid anyway. Others, like Wagner, couldn't accept that the war was over and hid because their minds wouldn't let them believe otherwise. The psychological mechanism here is called cognitive dissonance. When reality contradicts your beliefs so strongly that accepting reality would destroy your sense of self, your mind rejects reality. It's a defense mechanism. It's your brain trying to protect you. But in Wagner's case, it meant protecting him from the truth so completely that he lived in a delusion for 27 years. Now, imagine being the Soviet soldiers who found Wagner in 1945. You're walking through a forest in Estonia. The war with Germany just ended. You're doing cleanup operations, making sure no German stragglers are hiding out. And you find this man, this skeletal man in a rotting World War I uniform, carrying a rusty rifle from the 1914, who genuinely believes he's fighting a war that ended when your grandfather was young. What do? How do you even process that? According to the Soviet report, the soldiers who found Wagner thought he was insane. They almost shot him because they thought he was dangerous. But one of the soldiers, A corporal named Alexei Volkov, according to the report, had studied history. He recognized the uniform. He realized this man wasn't a threat. He was a ghost. A living ghost from a war that ended 27 years ago. Volkov convinced his fellow soldiers to capture Wagner alive and bring him in for interrogation. Volkov's decision probably saved Wagner's life, at least temporarily. If different soldiers had found him, soldiers who didn't recognize the World War I uniform, they might have just shot him as a threat. And Wagner would have died, never knowing he'd outlived his war by nearly 3 decades. There's a detail in the Soviet report that I find particularly haunting. When they captured Wagner, he had a photograph with him. A worn, water-damaged photograph of a woman and a child. The interrogators asked him who they were. Wagner said it was his wife and daughter. He said he hadn't seen them since 1917, when he was deployed to the Eastern Front. He said he was fighting so he could go home to them. The Soviets tried to find Wagner's family. They had his name, or at least the name he gave them. They searched German records. They found a Wagner who had been reported missing in action in Estonia in 1918. The records listed a wife and daughter. The wife had remarried in 1923 after Wagner was declared dead. The daughter had died in 1944 during the bombing of Dresden. Wagner's family was gone. Everyone he'd been fighting to get home to was dead or had moved on decades ago. The Soviets never told Wagner this. What would be the point? He wouldn't have believed them anyway. In his mind, his wife and daughter were still waiting for him in 1918. That belief, that hope, was probably the only thing that kept him alive all those years. Taking that away would have been cruel. But here's the thing. That photograph Wagner carried, that image of his wife and daughter, was 30 years old by the time he was captured. His daughter, the little girl in the photo, would have been in her 30s if she'd lived. His wife would have been in her 50s. They'd lived entire lives, had entire experiences, while Wagner was frozen in time in that forest. His family moved on. The world moved on. Technology advanced. Nations rose and fell. Another world war came and went. And Wagner, in his forest, experienced none of it. He was a man out of time. Let me tell you what this story makes me think about. It makes me think about how fragile our sense of reality is. We assume we know what's real. We assume we know what year it is, what's happening in the world, what war we're fighting if we're fighting a war. But that sense of reality depends entirely on our contact with other people, with society, with information. Remove all of that, isolate someone completely, and their sense of reality becomes whatever their mind creates. Wagner's reality was 1918. For 27 years, it was always 1918, always late summer or early fall, always waiting for orders, always hiding from enemy patrols. That was his entire world. And in that world, he was still a young soldier, still fighting for the Kaiser, still hoping to go home to his wife and daughter. The fact that the real world had moved on didn't matter because he wasn't living in the real world anymore. He was living in the world his traumatized mind had created for him. There's a philosophical question here. If Wagner believed it was 1918, if his entire subjective experience was 1918, then in what sense was he actually living in 1945? His body was in 1945, but his mind, his consciousness, his reality, that was all in 1918. So which one is real? The objective calendar date or the subjective experience? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure anyone does, but it's worth thinking about, especially when we consider how many people, not just holdout soldiers, but anyone with severe mental illness or trauma, are living in a reality that doesn't match the calendar. For them, their subjective experience is their reality, and trying to force them to accept objective reality can be traumatic or impossible. Now let's talk about the aftermath. What happened to stories like Wagner's? How did the world process these cases of extreme holdout soldiers? The answer is, mostly they were forgotten. Wagner's case was documented in Soviet archives, but not publicized. The Soviet Union didn't want to draw attention to the fact that German soldiers were still hiding in Soviet territory decades after World War I ended. It was embarrassing. It suggested that Soviet control of newly acquired territories wasn't as complete as they claimed. So Wagner's story, and stories like it, were classified, filed away, only discovered by historians decades later when Soviet archives were opened in the 1990s. By that point, everyone involved was dead. Wagner was dead. The soldiers who found him were dead. The doctors who treated him were dead. All we have are documents, reports, faded photographs, scattered pieces of a story that sounds too strange to be true. But it is true. We know it's true because the documents exist, because multiple independent sources describe similar cases, because the phenomenon of holdout soldiers is well documented from multiple wars. Wagner is just the most extreme case we know of. A man who didn't just hide for years after his war ended. A man who hid for years after his war ended during an entirely different war, while believing he was still fighting the First War. Think about the layers of that. World War I ends in 1918. Wagner doesn't know. He keeps hiding. The 1920s pass. The 1930s pass. Hitler rises to power. Germany starts another war. World War II rages across Europe from 1939 to 1945. And Wagner, in his forest, knows none of this. He's still in World War I, still 1918, still waiting for the Kaiser's army to win so he can go home. And then, in August 1945, Soviet soldiers find him. 3 months after World War II ends in Europe. 27 years after World War I ends. And they try to explain to him that he's been living in the wrong timeline for nearly 3 decades, that he missed an entire generation, that the world he knew is gone, that everyone he knew is dead or has moved on. And he can't accept it. His mind won't let him. So he dies, possibly in 1948, still believing it's World War I, still believing the Kaiser will lead Germany to victory, still believing he'll go home to his wife and daughter someday. That's the tragedy. Not that he was captured, not even that he hid for 27 years. The tragedy is that he never got to go home. Not really, because the home he was fighting to get back to, the Germany of 1917, the wife and daughter of that time, they only existed in his mind. The real Germany had moved on without him. His real family was gone. He was fighting to return to a place that didn't exist anymore. And that's heartbreaking. Let me bring this back to something broader. World War I destroyed an entire generation. We know this. 9 million soldiers dead, 21 million wounded, millions more psychologically scarred. But we often don't think about the men like Wagner, the ones who survived physically but were destroyed mentally, the ones who came home in body but never in mind. Or worse, the ones like Wagner who never came home at all because their minds broke so completely they couldn't find their way back. Wagner represents something we don't like to talk about, the long tail of war, the damage that persists decades after the fighting stops, the soldiers who die 50 years after the war, not from bullets, but from starvation in a forest where they've been hiding because their minds never accepted that peace came. That's the real cost of war. Not just the immediate death toll, but the lives ruined, the minds broken, the decades of suffering that follow. And here's the final irony. Wagner survived World War I. He didn't die in combat. He didn't die from the Spanish flu that killed millions in 1918 and 1919. He survived all of that, but World War I killed him anyway. Just slowly, over 27 years, it killed him by trapping him in a moment of trauma so severe that his mind built walls to protect him, and those walls became a prison he could never escape. When Soviet soldiers found Wagner in August 1945, when they saw this skeletal man in a rotting World War I uniform asking about battles that ended decades ago, they were looking at the last casualty of World War I, a man who died mentally in 1918, but whose body kept going until 1945 or 48, a man who fought a war that existed only in his mind, a man who surrendered to the wrong war's victors because he didn't know his war had ended. So remember this story. Remember Private Wagner, if that was even his real name. Remember that wars don't end when treaties are signed. They end when the last soldier comes home. And sometimes the last soldier never comes home at all. Sometimes they just hide in a forest for 27 years, fighting a war that ended before they even knew it had begun to end, waiting for orders that will never come, hoping to return to a home that no longer exists. That's the last German soldier who didn't surrender until 1945. A man who thought it was still 1918. A man who lived in the wrong war. A man who got lost in time and never found his way back. And the saddest part, he probably wasn't the last. Somewhere out there, in some forest, in some mountain range, there might be another soldier, still hiding, still waiting, still fighting a war the world forgot, still believing it's a year that ended lifetimes ago, still hoping to go home to a place that exists only in memory. That's the real horror of war, not just what it does to us in the moment, but what it can do to us forever, trapping us in time, making us live in a reality that everyone else has moved past, turning us into ghosts, haunting the forests of Europe, still fighting wars that ended when our grandchildren were born. Private Wagner died, believing Germany would win World War I, that his sacrifice meant something, that he'd go home someday. In his mind, he was a soldier doing his duty. In reality, he was a man who lost 27 years of his life to a delusion built by trauma. Both things are true, and both things are heartbreaking. Remember him. Remember what war did to him. Remember that every war creates men like this. Men who get lost, men who never come home, men who die decades later still fighting battles that ended before they even realized they were over. That's the story of the last German soldier who surrendered in 1945, thinking it was still 1918. A story of trauma, delusion, and the incredible, terrible power of the human mind to protect us from realities too painful to accept. Even if that protection becomes a prison, we can never escape.